And there's a line that you had to be very careful of even if my affection for Priscilla was just on a human level, you had to be careful how you express that where it didn't cause jealousy.
At 85, Elvis Presley's former bodyguard finally broke the silence that haunted him for decades. With a trembling voice, he whispered, "Elvis wasn't who you thought he was." The man who stood closest to the king of rock and roll claims the world only saw the glitter, not the shadow behind the spotlight. Behind the music, the fame, and the charm lived a truth so shocking it could change everything you believe about Elvis. After years of silence, the man who guarded his life is ready to tell it all, and what he reveals will leave you breathless. The night the king's secret began to speak. The rain fell hard over Memphis that night, a heavy curtain of silver that blurred the streetlights and turned the nursing home windows into trembling mirrors. Inside one of those dim rooms, Ray Carter sat in a worn armchair, his back slightly bent by the years but his eyes still sharp as broken glass. At 85, he had learned how to live with silence. For decades, he had guarded memories no one else dared to touch. But on this stormy night, silence finally came knocking with a sound he could not ignore. A soft tap echoed on his door. It was too late for nurses, too early for the restless shuffle of other residents. Ray's hand tightened on the armrest. When the door creaked open, a young woman stepped inside, her coat damp with rain and her eyes glowing with determination. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, pushing back her hood, "my name is Sarah Miller. I've come a long way to see you." Ray studied her without a word. The years had trained him to measure strangers before they ever spoke. Sarah carried a leather satchel pressed to her chest, and from it she pulled a neat stack of photographs, backstage passes, and letters browned with age. The faint smell of old paper filled the room as she laid them carefully on the table between them. "I believe," Sarah said, her voice trembling with excitement, "that you know things about Elvis Presley that the world never heard. I think you were there when the truth was buried." Ray's jaw tightened. He had heard every theory, every wild story that fans built around the man they called the King. For 45 years, he had walked past reporters and cameras with nothing but a polite shake of the head. But as he looked at the pictures on the table, faces frozen in time, nights filled with music and secrets, something stirred in him. He reached out slowly, his weathered fingers brushing a photograph of Graceland glowing beneath a velvet night sky. His hands trembled as if the paper itself carried the hum of a memory. "People think they knew Elvis," Ray whispered, his voice rough but steady. "They did not. The world has never met the real man." The rain outside deepened into a low thunder. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Will you tell me?" she asked. "I promise I'll protect your name if that's what you want. No one has to know." Ray cut her off with a slow shake of his head. "This story isn't about me," he said, his eyes glinting in the weak light. "It's about the king who was never truly crowned." Sarah waited, afraid to breathe. The room seemed to shrink around them. Ray pressed a palm flat against the table, his gaze fixed on the scattered mementos. For decades, he had carried these memories like locked boxes inside his chest. He had sworn to protect them, to honor the trust of a man who once ruled the world with a guitar and a smile. But now the years pressed heavy on his shoulders, and the weight of silence felt like a chain. "I've kept quiet longer than I should have," he said softly. "Elvis trusted me, but the truth has a way of asking for air." Sarah's heart quickened. "What truth?" she asked. Ray's eyes shifted to the rain-streaked window. Lightning flickered across the sky, and for a moment the room was washed in silver. He remembered the sound of screaming fans, the glitter of stage lights, the echo of laughter in the long halls of Graceland. He remembered the man who wore the crown and the man who hid behind it. "People loved the king of rock and roll," Ray said, "but the man I knew, he was different. He carried battles no one ever saw. The world wanted a hero. They never cared for the soul behind the songs." Sarah leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you saying Elvis wasn't the person we all believed?" Ray gave a slow, heavy nod. "Elvis Presley lived two lives," he said. One for the crowds, one for the night. You saw the first, I lived in the second. The rain hammered harder against the glass, as if urging him on. Sarah's recorder clicked softly, but Ray barely noticed. He was no longer in the nursing home. He was back in the smoke-filled rooms of the late 60s, watching a young man with a crooked smile and eyes full of secrets pace the floors of Graceland. Ray's voice dropped to a low rumble. I met him on a hot July day. He walked into that room wearing a grin that could break hearts and a look in his eyes that could break your soul. People think fame makes you larger than life, but what I saw was a man already running from something he couldn't name. Sarah's fingers tightened around her pen. What was he running from? Ray let out a breath that seemed to carry 45 years of memories. That, he said, his eyes darkening, is where the story begins. The room fell silent except for the steady beat of rain. The photographs lay scattered across the table like pieces of a puzzle, waiting for someone brave enough to fit them together. Sarah felt the pull of something larger than gossip, larger than music, a truth wrapped in shadows, ready to be told. Ray leaned back, his face half hidden in the flicker of the hallway light. You want to know the real Elvis, he said slowly. Not the posters, not the voice on the records. You want the man who laughed too loud and trusted too much. You want to know what he whispered when the stage lights passed away. Sarah's breath caught. Yes, she said. Pardon me. Ray's eyes locked with hers, sharp and unyielding. Then listen, he said. Listen carefully, because once you hear it, you'll never hear his music the same way again. Behind the velvet gates of Graceland, Ray Carter closed his eyes and let the memory pull him back, past the nursing home walls, past the gray years that had quietly stolen his youth. It was the mid-1960s when he first stepped into Elvis Presley's world. The king of rock and roll was everywhere, on the radio, on movie screens, on the lips of screaming fans. To the world, Elvis was untouchable, a shining force of music and charm. But Ray's first night at Graceland showed him something different, something he would never forget. The gates opened with a slow groan, revealing the mansion bathed in gold and electric blue. Lights blinked like stars across the long driveway, while the sound of music rolled from somewhere deep inside. Cars crowded the lawn, their chrome bodies glinting under the moonlight. Ray could smell the sweet smoke of barbecue, the rich perfume of expensive cologne, and the faint leather scent of jackets hung carelessly over chairs. It felt like stepping into another universe, one built on music, glitter, and restless hearts. Inside, the air buzzed with life. Laughter tumbled through the halls, glasses clinked, and music pulsed from a record player that never seemed to stop. Women in bright dresses twirled across the floor, while men in sharp suits exchanged jokes and handshakes. And then came the sound that made the room fall still for a heartbeat, the warm, rich laugh of Elvis Presley. Ray turned and saw him for the first time. Elvis stood in the center of the room, a man who seemed to shine from within. His hair gleamed black as midnight. His eyes carried a spark that drew everyone close. He wore a deep blue jacket that caught the light with every move. The crowd around him shifted like a tide, people leaning in just to catch a word or a glance. Elvis, someone called, handing him a drink. He smiled, a grin so wide and easy it could melt a stone. Ray felt his breath catch. This was the man the world adored, the king whose music set hearts on fire. But even in that first moment, Ray saw something else. Behind the smooth charm, behind the confident stance, there was a flicker, quick and quiet, like a shadow passing over a candle. Later that night, Ray followed Elvis through the winding halls of Graceland. The music and laughter faded as they stepped into a smaller room lined with books and photographs. Here, the lights were softer, the air calmer. Elvis poured himself a drink and turned to Ray with a look that was strangely shy. "You must be the new guy," Elvis said, offering his hand. His voice carried the warmth of the South, gentle but steady. "Yes, sir," Ray replied. Elvis chuckled. "Do not call me sir, just Elvis." That simple smile broke the tension, but Ray could feel an invisible weight pressing down on the room. For all the power Elvis carried on stage, here he seemed almost ordinary, humans. As the weeks passed, Ray began to see the two sides of the man he guarded. On stage, Elvis was unstoppable. He moved with a confidence that set the crowd on fire, hips swaying, guitar blazing, voice strong enough to shake walls. When the curtain rose, he became a storm of energy and light, a figure so magnetic that no one could look away. But when the lights dimmed and the doors closed, a different Elvis appeared. In quiet corners of Graceland, Ray found a man who often sat alone with his thoughts. He could be playful, laughing at small jokes, or gentle, asking about Ray's family with real concern. Yet there were moments when his eyes would drift to the window, searching for something far beyond the gates. Late at night, Elvis sometimes called Ray into the den where they would talk while the house slept. The king would stretch out on the couch, his hair loose, his voice soft. "Do you ever wonder," Elvis would ask, "if people love the man or just the name?" Ray never knew how to answer. He could only listen as Elvis spoke of fears he hid from the world, fears of fading fame, of songs that might one day be forgotten, of a world that wanted the icon but never cared for the man. The signs of struggle grew clearer as time went on. Ray often found unread letters piled on Elvis's desk, their edges curling with neglect. In the music room, sheets of half-written songs lay scattered like broken pieces of thought. Some nights, Elvis would stare into the mirror for long, silent minutes, his reflection a stranger he seemed unable to recognize. Sleep rarely came easy to him. Ray would hear footsteps in the halls at 3 in the morning, the faint creak of doors opening and closing. Sometimes Elvis would wander out to the garden, his robe brushing the wet grass as he gazed at the night sky. Other times he would sit at the piano, fingers barely touching the keys, humming fragments of melodies that never found words. And then there were the phone calls. They came at strange hours, sharp rings slicing through the quiet house. Elvis would answer with a low voice and disappear into a side room, the door closing softly behind him. When he returned, he often wore a look Ray could not read, half relief, half sorrow. Before concerts, Elvis occasionally vanished for hours. No one dared to question it. Staff members exchanged glances but said nothing. Some whispered about the other Elvis, a part of his life locked away from even those closest to him. Through it all, Ray grew fiercely protective. He watched as the world demanded more and more from a man who already gave everything. Fans screamed for the king, but Ray saw the boy from Tupelo still hiding inside, the boy who only wanted peace and a little kindness. Elvis had a heart too big for his good, Ray would later say. He could fill a stadium with his voice, but he carried loneliness like a second skin. One evening, after a show that left the crowd wild and breathless, Elvis sank into a chair backstage. Sweat glistened on his brow, but his eyes were distant. Ray handed him a towel and said nothing. "They love the music," Elvis murmured, staring at the floor. "But do they love me?" Ray felt a chill run through him. He wanted to tell Elvis that he was loved, truly loved, but the words stuck in his throat. How do you comfort a man who can make thousands scream his name, yet feels alone in a room full of people? As the years passed, Ray learned to recognize the small signs of wear. The way Elvis's smile would fade too quickly, the quiet sighs after the crowds were gone, the way his fingers lingered over a piano key long after the music stopped. The rhinestone suits and flashing lights were only armor, shining shields against a world that demanded perfection. Still, beneath the glitter, Ray often glimpsed the man Elvis once was, a childlike soul who loved simple jokes, late-night hamburgers, and the thrill of a new melody. Those moments were rare and fragile, like catching sunlight through a crack in the clouds. The night the music slipped away, Ray Carter leaned back in his chair, the sound of rain tapping against the window as he spoke. His voice carried the weight of memories that had waited decades to be told. The last years with Elvis, he began slowly, were like standing in the middle of a storm that never ended. The music was still loud, the crowd still screaming, but something dark was moving behind it all. The final tours were a blur of flashing lights, endless hotel rooms, and nights that bled into mornings. Ray remembered the constant rush, airports at dawn, Arenas packed with faces, the heavy smell of sweat and perfume clinging to every stage curtain. Elvis would step out under the bright lights, his white jumpsuit shining like a star against the blackness, and the world would roar. But behind the curtains, the king's shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He gave everything he had to those shows, Ray said quietly. But I could see the cost in his eyes. Every night took a little more from him. Graceland, once a place of laughter and music, began to feel like a fortress. Strange visitors came after midnight, men Ray did not know, slipping through the gates with briefcases and hushed voices. They left as quickly as they arrived, their faces hidden in the glow of the porch light. Elvis started locking doors that had always stayed open. He kept curtains drawn even in the bright Memphis afternoons. He was sure someone was watching, Ray recalled. He'd say, "Ray, do not trust the silence, they're out there." I never knew who he meant, but the fear in his voice was real. Elvis spoke more often about freedom during those nights. Between rehearsals and late meals in the kitchen, he would stare at the marble floors and talk in a low, steady tone. "What if I just walked away?" he once asked, his eyes fixed on a half-empty coffee cup. No more shows, no more cameras, just gone. Ray thought it was a passing thought, the kind of dream a tired man whispers when the world feels too heavy. But as the months passed, Elvis's words began to carry a sharper edge. He hinted at plans, quiet, careful plans that stretched beyond the walls of Graceland. "He told me there were places he could go where no one would find him," Ray said. He talked about hidden accounts, recordings no one had heard, letters written in codes only a few people could understand. It wasn't a fantasy, he was preparing for something. But the world around Elvis was not built to let him go. Managers, record executives, and even some old friends depended on him. Every concert meant millions. Every tour kept the machine alive. Ray remembered heated conversations behind closed doors, the sharp voices of men who controlled contracts and money. They did not just want him to keep performing, Ray said, his eyes narrowing. They wanted him to. Too many people had too much to lose, and some of them made sure he knew what would happen if he tried to walk away. The warnings were subtle at first, missed calls, cryptic notes, a quiet word from someone who seemed nervous. Then came the threats, hidden behind smiles and handshakes. Elvis laughed them off in public, but Ray saw the tension building. The king who once commanded crowds now checked every shadow, every doorway, as if danger waited in the dark. The last time Ray spoke to Elvis was a night carved into his heart. It was just days before August 16, 1977. The house was quiet, the air heavy with summer heat. Elvis sat on the edge of a couch, his head lowered, a single lamp casting a pale glow over the room. He looked tired in a way I'd never seen, Ray said, his voice trembling. Not just physically, tired of the world, tired of being Elvis Presley. Elvis motioned for Ray to sit beside him. For a long time, he said nothing, only tapping his fingers against his knee. Finally, he whispered, "I'm tired of being Elvis. I do not belong to myself anymore." Ray felt a chill despite the heat. Before he could speak, Elvis gave a faint, almost sad smile. "The end," he said softly, "would not be what they think." Those words followed Ray into the long days that came next. When the morning of August 16th arrived, Graceland was strangely still. Staff moved through the halls with hurried steps and hushed voices. Doors that were usually open were locked tight. Ray's calls to certain rooms went unanswered. "It felt wrong the moment I walked in," Ray said, like everyone already knew something, but no one would say it out loud. He never saw the body himself. When the time came, the casket was closed, the lid sealed as if to keep the truth hidden inside. There were whispers of missing security footage, of cameras turned off at just the right moments. Questions hung in the air, but no one dared to ask them too loudly. Ray left the house that evening with a hollow ache he could not name. The world mourned the king of rock and roll, but he carried doubts that never faded. "People talk about conspiracies," Ray said, his eyes clouded. "But I know what I heard, what I saw. Elvis told me he was leaving, maybe not in the way people imagine, but leaving all the same." He paused, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I think he found a way out." Maybe he staged it. Maybe he slipped through a door the rest of us couldn't see. All I know is the Elvis I knew was too clever, too determined to let the world decide his ending. For years, Ray kept those memories locked away, a private ache he carried in silence. Even now, when he hears a song drift from an old jukebox or catches the familiar curl of a melody, he wonders. Sometimes, he said softly, I think about those words, the end would not be what they think. And I cannot help but believe he meant it. Maybe Elvis isn't gone. Maybe he's just free. The rain outside deepened, a steady rhythm against the glass. Ray leaned back, lost in the echo of a voice that once filled stadiums and still haunted quiet nights. Whether Elvis Presley truly left that August morning or simply stepped into the shadows, only a few will ever know. But Ray's heart held fast to one unshakable truth. The king was never a man who followed rules. If anyone could escape the cage of fame, it was Elvis, the song that never ends. The rain outside the nursing home window fell in soft, endless streams, washing the world in a gray hush. Inside, Ray Carter sat in the dim glow of a bedside lamp, his hands folded tightly in his lap. 85 years old and wrapped in a worn sweater, he looked like any other quiet resident of the Memphis facility. But his eyes, sharp, restless, carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories, gave him away. The young journalist who had come to see him shifted nervously in the chair across the table. He had spent years chasing rumors, chasing whispers that Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, had never truly passed away. He had read every wild theory, every grainy photograph, every late-night confession from strangers who swore they had seen Elvis in faraway places. Yet tonight, the truth sat only a breath away, hidden behind the careful silence of the man in front of him. Ray stared at the rain-slicked window for a long moment before speaking. People think they buried him, he said quietly, his voice rough with age. But some things, some people, they do not go away that easily. The journalist leaned forward. You mean Elvis? Ray did not answer. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a small, yellowed postcard. The edges were frayed, the handwriting faint but unmistakable. On the front was a picture of a dusty road cutting through an empty desert. On the back, a single line in looping script, Blue Moon, same old tune. It came a year after he was supposed to be gone, Ray said, his thumb brushing the card as though it were a fragile relic. That little phrase, and only he and I knew it, a private joke from a night in Vegas. No one else could have written it. The journalist's breath caught. You think it was from him? Ray gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. I do not think so. I know. For years after the world mourned Elvis's death in August of 1977, strange things kept finding their way to Ray. Anonymous postcards like this one, always from different towns, always carrying words only Elvis would know. Once a cassette tape arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. On it was a song, soft, raw, unfinished. A voice that was older, rougher, but heartbreakingly familiar sang about a quiet life far from bright lights. It wasn't a sound-alike, Ray said, his eyes glinting. It was him. I'd staked my life on it. The journalist scribbled furiously, his pen scratching across the page. Did you ever see him? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ray hesitated, then leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. Not in the way you'd think, he said. But there were moments. He told of a winter night in the early 80s when he stopped at a small diner in a remote Texas town. A man sat in the corner booth, hidden beneath a worn baseball cap and a heavy coat. The man kept his head low, but when he looked up to sip his coffee, Ray caught a flash of eyes so blue they seemed to hold the sky itself. Those eyes, Ray murmured, his voice trembling. I knew them better than my reflection. And when he saw me just for a second, he smiled. Not a big grin, just a tiny curve, like he was saying, I'm okay. Then he walked out into the night. The journalist swallowed hard. Did you follow him? No, Ray said simply. That wasn't my place anymore. He leaned forward, his face lit by the faint lamp. Listen carefully, he said. I'm not telling you Elvis is alive. I'm telling you, the man they think they buried wasn't the one who mattered. Elvis Presley, the name, the legend, the crown, that's what the world buried. But the soul behind it? That's harder to put in the ground. Ray's voice softened, carrying the weight of years he had spent guarding a truth no one wanted to believe. He wanted out. Long before the end, he talked about leaving it all behind. The money, the crowds, the screaming. He used to say, "I just want to be a man again, Ray, just a man who can walk down a street and not be chased." The journalist looked up from his notes. "You're saying he planned it?" Ray gave a faint, sad smile. He had a name picked out, a place too, a cabin somewhere far from Memphis, where no one would ever think to look. "I helped him. I found the routes. I made the calls. I set up the papers. I was supposed to keep the king safe," he said, his eyes glistening. "And maybe I did." The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside, the storm eased, leaving only the sound of soft dripping water. Ray rubbed his hands together as though trying to warm himself against memories that still chilled him. After that day in August when they said he was gone, I kept waiting for a sign. Something to tell me I'd done the right thing. And then the postcards started coming. Little notes, a lyric, a memory. Always just enough to keep me wondering if he'd made it out alive. The journalist leaned closer. "Why tell me now?" "Because I'm old," Ray replied with a weary chuckle. "Because I can feel the clock ticking. And because people deserve to know the man, not just the myth. Elvis wasn't a statue or a headline. He was a soul trapped in a cage he did not build. And if he found a way to break free, maybe that's the happiest ending he could have had." His eyes softened as he spoke of the friend he had once protected. He wasn't perfect. Lord knows he wasn't. But he had a heart as big as the sky. He gave everything to the world, and in the end, all he wanted was a quiet life. Maybe he got it. Maybe that's the miracle nobody talks about. The journalist closed his notebook, his hands trembling slightly. The story he had chased for years was finally laid before him. Not as a wild conspiracy, but as a tender confession of loyalty and love. As he stood to leave, Ray looked up, his voice barely more than a whisper. "If you ever hear a song you do not recognize but feels like home," he said, "it might be him. Somewhere out there singing to the night, not for the world, just for himself." The journalist paused in the doorway, the postcard burning in his pocket like a living heartbeat. Behind him, Ray turned back to the window, his eyes lost in the rain. In the quiet of that Memphis night, the question lingered like an unfinished melody. Did Elvis Presley die, or did the man behind the legend simply slip away to find the freedom he was denied? Only Ray seemed to know, and he wasn't telling anything more.